इंडिया स्पीक्स डेली को सब्सक्राइब करें, उसके बेल आइकन को ज़रूर दबाएं यदि आपको इसकी पत्रकारिता पसंद हो। धन्यवाद।
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to India Speaks Daily. India is going to witness the signing of peace deal between the US and the Taliban in the Qatari capital of Doha. And this is a huge historical development, and also from a geopolitical perspective, the signing of a peace deal between the US and the Taliban. This is expected to eventually lead the way for the end of decades-long war in Afghanistan, and is expected to sort of lay out the roadmap for establishment of peace in Afghanistan. And of course, the first crucial step post the agreement would be the gradual evacuation of the US armed forces from Afghanistan. Now, whether negotiations with a terrorist organization like Taliban are actually going to lead to an end of conflict, this is something controversial and only time will tell. But leaving that, at the moment, at this juncture, it is certainly a historical landmark agreement, a landmark meeting between the US and the Taliban, and India is expected to attend this meeting. In fact, the meeting is scheduled to happen today in the Qatari capital of Doha. As many as 50 countries, including India and Pakistan, have been invited to witness the signing of the peace agreement, the peace deal between the US and the Taliban. Now, coming to India, why is it important that India is participating in the signing of this peace deal? What is significant here from the point of view of India's participation? So this is the first time that India has come closest to recognizing the Taliban as an official entity by expressing its willingness to participate in a meeting which has the Taliban, by expressing its willingness to sit across the table where an organization like Taliban is present. India is then expressing its willingness to engage with the Taliban, even if it's through the US in an indirect manner. But this is certainly a very radical, a very important development from the point of view of foreign policy of India, from India's new role in the geopolitical scheme of things, from India's new role in the global scheme of things. So India's participation in the meeting is a very significant one, and it's a very important one. And from a geopolitical perspective, India's participation in the meeting makes a lot of sense, because let's not forget that before, when the Taliban regime was in power in Afghanistan, Indian government had not recognized the Taliban as an official entity. In fact, it had denounced the Taliban regime. So this is definitely a change in position, a change in stance as far as the Indian government is concerned. And from a geopolitical perspective, India's participation is very important, because as a lot of analysts say, India now, here right now, is being realistic, and it is also an acknowledgement on part of India about its increasing geopolitical importance, and it is an understanding by India that it can no longer, and it should no longer remain isolated from major global issues, from major world issues, and it has realized that it has to shed its hesitancy, shed its reluctance, and not remain in an isolated position, but work together with the major world powers, with the major global powers like the US, to witness such important global agreements, to witness such important global processes in the making. And then, of course, there is the equation of the developing relationship between the India and the US. Although, of course, analysts and scholars are saying that the recent visit of US President Donald Trump has got nothing to do with India's decision to attend this signing of peace agreement between the US and the Taliban. But certainly we know better. the contours of the India and the US relationship, the way the Indo-US relationship has been developing, and especially in the backdrop of the recent visit of the US President Donald Trump to India, there are two major factors emerging: the thrust of the relationship on security, the thrust of the relationship on defense, as well as its focus on cooperation in the area of counter-terrorism measures. Counter-terrorism operations have emerged as a very important area of cooperation between India and the US. And it is in this context that India's participation in the signing of peace deal between the US and the Taliban, it is in this context that we need to look at India's decision to participate in the meeting, because India, at a time when India is stepping up its cooperation with the US in the field of counter-terrorism operations, India has to be a part of all initiatives that have been taken by the US in its own way to foster global peace. As I said, the kind of results that they will yield later on is something that I'll come back to later, and we are certainly skeptical about that. But as a major player in the on a geopolitical stage right now, and as a major ally of the US, it is only pragmatic from the point of view of India that it has decided to be a part of this very important meeting. Now, coming to the controversies, the red flags. So there are two views to the whole thing. Some scholars argue that by choosing to become a witness to the US Taliban peace talks, by choosing to first of all participate in the US Taliban peace talks, India is being slightly flexible, and India is, as I said, taking a certain pragmatic step by giving up its insistence on calling Taliban a terrorist organization. And the scholars argue that by expressing its willingness to participate in these peace talks, India has realized that it can no longer just keep on denouncing Taliban as a terrorist organization, and that in order to bring any sort of internal peace and stability to Pakistan, as well as in order to root out the Islamic terrorist network that has affected India also to a major extent, it is important for India to negotiate with Taliban. So there are people, there's this one camp who are calling this as a very positive evolution of India's foreign policy, that India has decided to attend this meeting and that India has decided to engage with the Taliban indirectly. On the other hand, there are a whole bunch of critics, a whole bunch of people, experts who view this in a negative light. And I think there's a lot of truth in that perception. There's a lot of veracity in that perception, because Taliban, at the end of the day, is a terrorist organization. No matter the kind of things Taliban says in front of the global media on the US television, Taliban at the end of the day is an organization which has its roots in Islamic extremism, Islamic terrorism, and which has been instrumental in the spread of Islamic terrorism, radical Islam, which has been instrumental in spreading the ideology of jihad across the world. So what makes us think in such a simplistic manner that simply by signing a peace deal with the US, Taliban is going to turn peaceful overnight? So of course there's a lot of worry and there's a lot of concern at India's decision to participate in this meeting and to not register its protest at the fact that the US is actually going to sign a peace deal with Taliban. Because if Taliban becomes powerful in Afghanistan again, if Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan, then the entire movement of radicalization, of Islamic radicalization of Afghanistan's youth, Afghani youth, and their initiation into the cult of jihadi terrorism will begin again. It will spread like rapid fire. It will gain ground again, and which won't be good for India's internal security. And then once Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan, then nobody is going to be able to control it, neither India nor the US. So this is something that India has to realize. This is something that India has to acknowledge. And then in a way, it also signifies failure of India's Afghanistan policy as well. Because for a long time, India tried to engage with Afghanistan. India has in fact India has very good relations with Afghanistan. India has given all sorts of possible aid to Afghanistan to enable the country to develop its economy, to develop its infrastructure, and not just that, India has also consistently made efforts, the Indian government has consistently made efforts to create conducive conditions for a democracy, for a democratic government in Afghanistan, in consonance with the wishes of the people of Afghanistan, in consonance with the wishes of the Afghani people. Because unlike Pakistan, Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan, the government there also has been to a large extent willing to cooperate with India to get rid of the clutches of Islamic extremism in Afghanistan. And therefore, to this kind of a peace agreement, which will eventually create conditions for the establishment of a Taliban rule in Afghanistan, is going to be disappointing for both Afghanis as well as Indians. Because let's not forget it, once Taliban begins its Islamic radicalism in Afghanistan, that it's not going to be good for both the Afghani Muslims as well as the minorities living in Afghanistan, including Hindus, who already have a threat of persecution there. And once Taliban gains legitimacy through a peace deal, that threat of persecution of minorities in Afghanistan will become even huge. That threat will become even more pronounced and colossal. So this certainly, in a way, signifies, sadly enough, a failure of India's Afghanistan policy, since it hasn't been able to really go against the grain and persuade the US to not really negotiate with a terrorist organization like Taliban to find another way out. And then, of course, talking about other things in Afghanistan, apart from minorities, women will again become at the receiving end of the Talibani regime once Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan, once it gains a greater degree of legitimacy in Afghanistan, and the educational rights of women, the property rights of women, everything will be just taken away, everything will just suffer a backlash, and it will open doors for rampant abuse of women and minorities in Afghanistan if the Taliban regime is legitimized, if the Taliban regime in Afghanistan gains legitimacy. And let's not forget that for the US President Donald Trump, right now what he's doing, the signing of the peace deal, it's just a way to get votes in the upcoming elections. Because all the citizens of America, a huge number of them at least, of course want the US to be out of Afghanistan. So this is just a way, this is just a strategy for Donald Trump to appease his own people. This is just a strategy for him to win the confidence of Americans and to get more votes in the upcoming elections. Once this peace deal is signed, then who knows, after the US elections, it is not necessary that Mr. Donald Trump will come to power. Somebody else might come to power. And even if Trump becomes the US president again, even if he becomes the US president again, he's actually not going to do a thing. He's not going to be concerned at all about what Taliban is doing in Afghanistan or what Taliban is doing to the whole subcontinent, which can have a disastrous impact on the internal security of countries like India. The US is just trying to get out of the mess that it has created in Afghanistan. It's trying to wash its hands of the situation. And tomorrow it's not going to be bothered at all about what the Taliban is doing anywhere, unless and until, of course, the Taliban is carrying some terrorist attacks on the US soil. So India has, of course, decided towards the signing of this peace deal. But at the same time, India has to be very cautious, and India has to understand what can lay forward. India has to understand that making Taliban powerful within Afghanistan again, enfranchising Taliban again, or even becoming an observer to such a peace process can have grave implications for India's own internal security.